Okay, we are on. So, hello everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So, today we have this presentation entitled Lessons Learned from John Deely, which will be given by Dr. Gary Shank. Dr. Gary Shank, thank you so much for being here with us today. And also, I'm very glad to receive here Dr. Marita Soto. She'll be the commentator of today's presentation. So, I would like to start by introducing Dr. Gary Shank. Dr. Gary Shank is a retired professor of educational research at Duquesne University in Petersburg. He's also he founded the Center for Qualitative and Semiotic Inquiry. He has been active in semiotics since 1979, when he attended his first Semiotic Society of America meeting at his alma mater in Indiana University. He has been active in semiotics and educational research since then. He was a founding member and past president of the Semiotics in Education, SIG, at the American Educational Research Association. He has published in Semiotica and the American Journal of Semiotics. He has been plenary speaker for the Biosemiotics convening, where he talked about the semiotics of PS 101. And he has also published extensively in qualitative research, where he has authored and co-authored 3 related books. In this educational semiotics book series titled Signs and Symbols in Education, Dr. Shank is looking for visionary works on education and semiotics and how they can reinforce and build from each other. Dr. Gary Shank, it's an honor to have you here, and you can start your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you to everybody for coming here. Um, it's it's going to be kind of a hybrid presentation in which I talk about what I think are some of John's most fundamental ideas and try to put them in clear terms, and also to illuminate a little bit about John Deely, the person. So, can we begin the slideshow, please? There we go. Okay. So, next slide, please. Okay. Since I'm saying that these are lessons learned, they're lessons that I learned, so I should try to give you a little context of where I kind of came into this. And when I go back and look at things, my very first research question was, why does the world make so much sense so much of the time when by all rights it shouldn't? And that's been a very fertile question. The closest to an answer that I have to that now is by saying it's because if the world has to make sense all of the time for pretty much every living thing in order to maintain survival. So, for example, if you're walking through the woods and you see a big dark shadow ahead of you, you don't go, "Huh, that's a big dark shadow." You go, "What is that? I need to find out what that is, because otherwise it might eat me." Okay, but that's that's kind of how I work sideways into semiotics. Okay, since I've been a methodologist most of my career, I've also approached semiotics in terms of how can semiotics help us to do inquiry that could not be done any other way. And I think, and I'm tying that all up again in a long overdue book on the semiotic inquiry. And the interesting thing about it is if you look at the semiotic inquirer, Peirce talked about the semiotic inquirer in his very first works. And unlike just about everything else he wrote, he never changed his thinking on that, the notion of the semiotic inquirer being driven by genuine doubt. So that's the goal of my work now that I'm working on, is to equip the semiotic inquirer with the proper tools to do semiotic inquiry. Okay. When I met John, he and his work opened my ideas to possibilities to explore that I never knew existed. And also, John was, most importantly to me, a dear and cherished friend who taught me many lessons of many different types. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a quick travelogue. The first time I met John Deely was at the I think it was the 5th Semiotic Society of America meeting in 1981 in Nashville. And that was a really interesting meeting, and it was very delightful. It's my first full-fledged semiotic meeting. And John was giving a talk on cognition and semiotics. And since I was a fairly newly minted PhD in cognitive psychology, I thought it would be pretty interesting to go hear his talk. And so we met each other and we started chatting, and that started our friendship, which lasted the rest of his life. One of the key places that I plugged into John, met up with him, is that from I think it was 1980 to 1984. I started attending in 1982. The International Summer Institute of Semiotics and Structural Studies. I missed one, and there should be another S in there. This was a 4-week-long summer program that alternated between Indiana University and the University of Toronto. And the uniqueness about this is it wasn't just a situation where you had a bunch of people come in to give a talk. There were actual courses. There were 2-week courses, and they brought in people to teach those courses. And the person who orchestrated the ISIS in Bloomington was Tom Sebiak. And the person who orchestrated the ISIS in Toronto was Paul Buisac. And so Buisac and Sebiak got themselves into kind of a friendly competition and to see who could outdo the other. So when I went to my first ISIS, it was in 1982, and it was at the University of Toronto. And so Paul had brought in people like Michel Foucault. He brought in John Searle. He brought in Eugene Vance. He brought in a whole list of people, not just to come and give a lecture, but to actually teach. And that was a really, really remarkable experience for a young semiotician to be able to interact in that direction. Aiko taught in a couple of those ISISes, and Aiko and John team taught a course. Jerome Bruner, Howard Gardner, Eibel Eibelsfeld, all these folks, Paul Ekman, just an amazing group of distinguished scholars. One of my fondest memories is that I was staying at Massey College in Toronto, which is a little residence college, and most of the scholars were staying there as well. So I had the privilege of having dinner every night with like Refetir, Derrida. But my favorite dinner companion was Paul Ricoeur. And so Ricoeur was a very modest, humble man, lovely person. I'm sitting there and I have a book of his readings. And I bring it to the table with me because I had just come in. And he picks it up, opens it up, and starts inscribing it to me. And he looked at me and he said, "You don't mind if I do this, do you?" Right? That was just how unassuming he was. The other story is that he was talking about Peirce, and I said, "Professor Ricoeur, you just amaze me on how much the breadth and the depth of your knowledge." I said, "It's just unbelievable." And he says to me, he says, "Ah, Gary, everything that I learn at the feet of Merleau-Ponty," which I thought was a good little story. So John and I ran into the ISISes several times. The one in 84 was particularly interesting when he and Heimerding and a bunch of other folks were crafting one of the first manifestos. And I have a thing or two to say about that later. We visited each other's homes quite a bit. And there's some interesting stories about that, but he came to be a very dear friend. The last time I saw John, John's appointment at St. Vincent was a real delight to me because Latrobe is only about 40 miles from Pittsburgh. So there was this wonderful opportunity for us to be able to get together, but he was hardly there before, he had his stroke and then things started deteriorating. So the last time I actually got to see him was the day before he went into hospice. I think he was only in hospice for 4 or 5 days. And by that time, he seemed that he'd come to peace with the situation, which I was very glad to see. So from October 1981 to January 2017, John Deely was my friend, my dear friend. Next slide. So, who shaped John Deely? Who turned John Deely into the John Deely we know? Well, I'm sure a lot of you know that John started out as a Dominican novice and graduated from Dominican University. And the Dominicans really shaped his thought. Two of the most prominent Dominicans in his life were, and these are just two among many, were Benedict Ashley, and a very important colleague of his was Ralph Powell, who helped him with the translation of the Tractatus de Signis. Okay. So as a novice, he was reading Thomism. And that's an important point because in 1879, Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Eterne Patris, instructed Catholic seminaries to emphasize the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. And Leo XIII did that primarily because kind of a form of Cartesian idealism was creeping into the church where, for example, Kant said, God is unknowable. And that's pretty antithetical to Catholic thought. So he wanted to turn people back to Thomism. And the two prominent Thomists in the early 20th century, one was Etienne Gilson, and the other one was Jacques Maritain. So John read the work of Maritain when he was a novice, and he was really impressed with that. And so one of the things that the Maritain did is that he was emphasizing the nature and role of signs in thought. And he had actually started looking at that time, John of St. Thomas, and our John christened him John Poinsot. I think he wanted to give him more of an individual identity than just some sort of label. Okay, so Maritain's thought is woven into all of John's work. But John took Maritain's thought and took it further. One of the things that John said that was very revealing is that he respected Etienne Gilson. He respected his work. He said, but Gilson is a rear view mirror Thomist. He keeps looking back, whereas Maritain is a forward-looking Thomist. And that excited John because that's actually kind of where John, I think, saw himself grounded through that whole situation. So that was Jacques Maritain, the philosopher. And Jacques Maritain, the man, was very important to him as well. If you look down one, you'll see I mentioned Brooke Williams. I just wanted to make a point. Brooke, when she was Brooke Williams Smith, wrote a dissertation and eventually became a book on Maritain. And John Deely and Brooke met at a Maritain Association meeting. And they both admired not only Jacques Maritain, but Jacques' marriage to Raisa and how indivisible the two of them were and how they really drew, supported, and made each other with each other's growth. And in fact, John at his house in Latrobe had a sign that said Brooke John in one word, because that's how he looked at he and Brooke, that it wasn't Brooke and it wasn't John, it was Brooke John. And that was very much in the model of Maritain. So Tom Semiotic, of course, was a major influence with John. And the irony is that we go back to Maritain again, because a very young Tom Semiotic had been helping Maritain with a course, and Maritain kept telling Semiotic he should pay attention to John of St. Thomas. And Tom said, oh, okay. And for 17 years, he just sort of didn't worry about that. But then he hears through the grapevine that Deely is translating the Tractatus de Signis. And he goes, I should probably talk to this Deely guy. So Semiotic writes Deely a letter saying, I understand you're working with this. I would like to meet you so we could talk about it. And John, thinking nothing of it, just crumpled the letter up and threw it away. And then a couple of weeks later, he gets another letter from Semiotic, and he says, oh, okay. He said, maybe we should meet. And so they did meet, and that was a major incident in John's life. Okay. John and Brooke had many dogs. They had Beethoven, who was a street dog they picked up from Brazil. I know in Mexico they had Cachorro, which is a dog they picked up in Brazil. In the end, they had Bruno and Bella. And Bruno and Bella are still around. And they're living with Brooke. And they're having a very happy little life. And as he was coming into his later days, someone asked John, who would you like to give your eulogy? And John says, Bruno. Which I think is if Bruno could talk, he would have done it. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the lessons now and they're philosophical lessons and semiotic lessons. Okay? So let's take a look at the next slide, please. Okay, so when I say these are philosophical lessons, I say they are philosophical lessons for me. Okay, these are things that came into my consciousness through a variety of means, through John in his writing and his conversation. One of the primary things that I've picked up about semiotics, and especially as a philosophical dimension, is that the fact that semiotics is pretty clearly post-Cartesian. Okay, John and Charles Purser both independently discovered that where things went wrong in philosophy was with Descartes. And they came at it from different paths and different reasons, but they both came to that conclusion. And so essentially the model, John's model of philosophy, is we have this classical philosophy that gets kind of nurtured, and then it goes into Augustine, who then builds and helps build this framework of philosophical understanding for the Middle Ages, which then, because of the influx of Islamic texts on Aristotle had essentially been lost to the West, and through the influx of these Islamic translations and volumes of Aristotle, that brought about a big revolution in thinking and made possible the work of Thomas Aquinas. And so philosophy was moving along very nicely, getting more and more understanding of how to approach things and how to look at complex issues. And then Descartes comes along and sort of upsets the whole apple cart. Okay. Tom Sebeok used to tell a joke about Descartes. He said, I was flying first class back from Budapest, and who should be sitting beside me in first class but Rene Descartes? And so I said hi, and the steward walks by and says, would you like something to drink? And Descartes said, I think not, and then vanished. So, but anyway, that's how much love semiotics has for Descartes. Descartes is the author of modern philosophy, with this thing of breaking down knowledge into subjectivity and objectivity, created a whole slew of issues that helped define the modern philosophy stance toward many things. So you have objective, subjective, you have mind, you have body, you have mental, physical, you have material, ideas. You have all these mishmash of dichotomies. And John never actually told me this, but it was more of a question of, the old Confucian idea is if you give a person the three sides of a square, they should be able to put in the fourth. And the fourth that I put in is that modern philosophy was riddled with specious dichotomies. Okay, things like realism, idealism, subjective, objective, many more. And that was its first sin. And when we talk about semiotics, we'll talk about expanding these dichotomies into trichotomies, and what a remarkable difference it makes. And also in their insistence on nominalism. And the problem with nominalism from the semiotic perspective is that nominalism insisted that all relations were relations in awareness. In other words, relations were constructs. Relations were in nature because we made them. Okay. And that was, we'll talk about that in semiotics a little bit later. So there was this huge reconfiguration. John would call it trying to correct for the wrong turn that philosophy took in Cartesianism. So going beyond, coextensive to Descartes' work and this burgeoning Cartesian modern philosophy, the Latin tradition was continuing on and reached its maturity in the work of John of St. Thomas, which was kind of a culmination of the Latin philosophical tradition. I think you could make a good case for the Four Ages of Understanding being John's masterwork, because what it did is it put modernism in a proper perspective. And when he talked about Four Ages of Understanding, he talked about the age of reality, which was essentially the classical world, the age of being, which is the medieval world, the age of ideas, which is modernism, and then the age of signs, which is semiotically informed philosophy. And so by laying it out there, he was able to create a roadmap for us to move beyond modernism while still acknowledging the historical relation. History of ideas were always very important to John. And I think because they are important, but I think also because Brooke is a historian. And Brooke helped John develop a more nuanced understanding of the history of philosophy. So that was a very good part of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so what did I learn about semiotics? Okay. Well, when I came into semiotics, the prevailing major dimension was semiology, which was essentially the continuation of the work of Saussure, the signifying signified, translated through work of brilliant people, Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, Claude Lévi-Strauss. These are all semiologists, okay? And because semiology worked in dualities, it was able to fit into the Cartesian vision. But it didn't really grasp the nature and role and importance of semiosis. Semiosis was never really a functional concept in semiology. People argue with me that, but that's okay. So as we said before, the Cartesian philosophy is riddled with dichotomies. And when we consider dichologies as truncated trichotomies, then what we see is that if we take 3 and cram it into 2, it's going to alter the structure of the 2. So one of the most famous dichotomies was mind-body. But that's a truncation of the trichotomy of mind, body, and spirit, which is a really exciting idea. The one I want to talk about 2 of those expanded dichotomies into trichotomies. One of them was in the fundamental expansion of subjective objective into subjective, objective, and physical. So when we do that, when we take the purely physical out of objective. It reconfigures subjective and objective back to what they used to be prior to Descartes. Okay, prior to Descartes, we would say that subjectivity is just simply what John Dunsco's called Hecate, Haeceity, Hecate. I think it's two C's. Hecate is pretty much a good way of summarizing what subjectivity was prior to Descartes. Hecate works this way. It's the here and nowness of things. So the subjective becomes what is unique to the subject in distinction to everything else. Okay, because the subject is still connected to the objective and the physical, obviously, but it's also an extension. But also there is a basis of subjectivity. And so maybe the best way to explain Hecate is to say, if you asked an analytic philosopher who was essentially the last of the line of Cartesians, if you ask the analytic philosopher, which is more real, the human being or Gary Shank? The analytic philosopher would say, well, a human being is more real because it's universal. Okay, and Gary Shank is just one thing. So the universal is more real than the individual. Where Duns Scotus would say, not so fast. He said, if you look at Gary Shank predicates all aspects, all the defining aspects of human being. The defining aspects, that we say a human being has to have these things in order for us to call it a human being, right? So it has all those. It has all those abstractions and things. It also has Gary Shankness. And because it has Gary Shankness, it's more. It's not just a part of a whole, right? It's the whole incorporated into the particular. So that I think is a really exciting idea. So when John talked about purely objective reality, which he wrote a book on, it's, I think, one of his best books, where he said it's all about something is objective. Something has objective reality as known. So I'm sitting in the state of Pennsylvania. Okay, about 50 miles from here go due west is the state of Ohio. Okay. What is the reality of Pennsylvania, the reality of Ohio? Well, they encompass a certain amount of physical space. Okay. But when we talk about Pennsylvania and Ohio, we're primarily talking about how each state understands its role in people's culture's life. So, for example, I could be driving on the Ohio Turnpike going 70 miles an hour. And as soon as I cross the Pennsylvania line and it turns to 55, it's not true anymore, but it used to be true. Then that's not a minor thing, because I could get pulled over and got a ticket that I wouldn't have gotten in Ohio. Okay. So when we talk about things that are purely objective, we're talking about those things that we understand that are real as known. And that doesn't make them subjective. Okay? It just makes them known. And when people share that knowledge, that's when we have these sort of open distinctions. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute when we talk about relation. The other primary trichotomy is John was very explicit on the interplay of deduction, induction, and abduction. Very useful discussion. Prior to the introduction of abduction into popular consciousness, which it's pretty much getting there now, the deal was you had deduction and you had induction. And the argument was that deduction went from the general to the specific, and induction went from the specific to the general. Okay. But that missed the role of abduction, which is, so deduction is using a set of necessarily true statements to get to a necessary conclusion. So in terms of research, just about the only area of research in the empirical world on deduction is pure mathematics. That's deductive research, because you have declared something to be true by fiat. That's what an axiom is. And because you've declared it true and you don't have to worry about the consequences of it not being true, then you can operate deductively on these principles. Okay? So that's deduction. Induction is essentially the logic of science, where you gather information and you start putting together, right? So abduction is reasoning to meaning. I don't want to go into real big detail here, but all three of those pieces are necessary for a researcher to be able to use to work in the world of experience. Okay. And there are really nice places in Perse that lay that out. Okay. The next point, one of the things John told me, one of the last things he told me when we were talking, he said to me, he said, I wish in the 4 ages I talked about the age of relation instead of the age of sign. He said, because when you look at this whole aspect, that's where it really comes into full form. Okay. Relation for John was essentially the presence or operation of supra-subjectivity. So if we look at subjectivity, it deals with those things that are unique, the Hecate of things. But you also have intersubjectivity, where there are intersections between unique things. But then you also have this concept of supra-subjectivity. And going deep into the Latin tradition, John started with the distinction between ens reale, or real things, and ens rationale, things that are creations of the mind. Okay? And the argument that they were both real, and you could move back and forth between them. Okay? And because if you were a realist in the modernist tradition, what that meant is that you only believed in ens reale. Okay? And ens rationale was just people explaining stuff, but it wasn't really real. And if you were an idealist from the modernist tradition, then you thought the ens rationale were the basis of reality, and that ens reale is just, either not there or not very interesting. But what John said is you have the notion of supra-subjectivity, which says you're talking about relation that is independent, indifferent, he said, to whether something is an ens reale or an en rationality. It's in relation. So it's the the meta level of, that distinction between ens reality and ens rationality. And so you're able to move back and forth and work with that. And one of his examples of supersubjectivity is the mother-son example. He said, okay, you've got this mother and she's pregnant, but she doesn't know she's pregnant yet. What's the relationship between her and her son? Well, that relationship, before she's aware she's pregnant, that's an intersubjective relation. Okay. The two of them have both. The son is a forming self, and the mother is already a self. When the child is born and starts living, then it's still intersubjective, but it's also objective now, because the child is in the world, and the child can know the mother, and the mother can know the child, and the child can keep knowing the mother, and the mother can keep knowing the child. So there's a very strong objective in the post-Cartesian sense of the word objective. Now, unfortunately, in this example, the son dies. Now, what is the relationship of the mother and the son? John says, people would say there's no relationship anymore because the son's dead. It's all over, right? So the mother is no longer a mother because she doesn't have a living child. And John says, no. They're still related, but they're related supersubjectively in the sense that it's only objective. The way they're related is the fact that she knew her son. Now she's no longer knowing her son, but she knew her son. And that knowing of her son is the basis for the relationship between the two of them. And I think that's a really lovely indication of how relation, objectivity, subjectivity, trichotomies all kind of work together. And the last thing I want to talk about, I'm not going to talk too long on it, just basically to note it, is the notion of the semiotic animal. It's one of his last works. And for John, the semiotic animal is a creature, pretty much man, okay, where semiosis is more fundamental to experience than either objects or things. So our very nature as living creatures, as animals, is semiotic because of the notion of sign, the notion of semiosis, where we're using semiosis to fit together and pull together and structure the world. Okay? So, next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about some of the things that John taught me as a human being. Okay? Stand up for your principles. John, just to give you a quick review of his academic career, after he got his doctorate, his first academic job, he was working as an assistant to Mortimer Adler, and in fact was helping Adler write a book. Now, for pretty much anybody but John, that would be a wonderful door opener. That should be able to lead into a lot of opportunities, but not John, because as they're working on his book, there were a couple points in the book where John disagreed with Adler. And they said, well, maybe we can kind of, no. He said, you're wrong. There's no compromise here. You're wrong. And Adler says, but we need to make that point. And John says, okay, take my name off the book. And Adler says, you wrote at least half of this book. Your name deserves to be on this book. He said, I don't want my name on this book. And so essentially, John burned a bridge with Mortimer Adler. Okay. He goes then to the University of Ottawa, and it's not clear to me why he left. He never really talked about that. But that's where he lived with his first wife. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. Then he went to St. Mary's, which at that time was the co-ed school associated with Notre Dame, like Harvard and Radcliffe, that kind of relation. So he got another great job. So he got this job. The end of his first year, he's teaching a required second semester philosophy course to all girls, all young women who are ready to graduate. They just need this course. And John fails the entire class, gives the entire class grades of F. So now they can't graduate. And they said to him, John, the administration, why did you give them all F? Because they don't deserve to pass, right? And so then that's another bridge burned. And then he goes to Loras College, and was at Loras College for a number of years. And it was not a really good fit for John, but it was a strictly undergraduate institution. They had limited funding, but he plugged on. He did his work. He did the Tractatus there. So never shy away from a good fight. Well, John had a lot of fights with people, a lot of arguments, and created a lot of rancor. And a lot of times it was a good fight, and then John was in the right. But and that also relates to his standing up for his principles. Believe in yourself. Imagine, put yourself in John's shoes. You just bounced from Adler to Ottawa to Notre Dame to a diocesan college in Dubuque, Iowa. You're having trouble getting people to accept your ideas or even look at them or even give them a trial. And yet he never lost his belief in what he was doing. Okay. And when I say accept the consequences, well, I don't think he ever complained. I never heard him complain about the bridges he burned. Okay. Write down your ideas. John was always writing. Now, one of the sad things about when he had his stroke, that's when they discovered that he had terminal liver cancer. And the symptoms of that, the symptoms of that were very different for John. John experienced no real pain from the cancer. What it did is that it robbed him of his ability to write. He could not physically sit down and write. He couldn't get mind and pen working together, which in more ways was probably more of a torture for John than being racked with pain. I think he would have preferred to have been racked with pain as long as he could have kept working. So he was very dedicated to his work. He was very dedicated to make sure that he documented the flow of his thought. And as such, he's left us this treasure trove. So the next slide is the actual thing stops here. This next slide is sort of the legend of John Deely. So if people would like to hear a couple of these, there are plenty of them. There are a lot of them. These are some of my favorites. But bathtub adventures. John hated showers. John would never take a shower. He always had to have a bath. So every time that John would visit us, we'd have to get him a bath. And sometimes it's a little inconvenient to do a bath. Sometimes it's dangerous. Poor Terry Pruitt, he went to visit Terry and insisted on a bath, and threw his towel over a heater, and the towel caught on fire, and he almost burned down Terry's house. So, but it never swayed him from taking baths. I never understood. The phyto lettuce refers to the 1982 Semiotic Society meeting in Buffalo. And one of the speakers there giving a paper was Martin Crompton. I don't know if any of you knew Martin. A consummate gentleman, very lovely, very gentle, very kind person. Okay. And he gave the very first lecture on phytosemiotics, or the semiotic communications of plants. And the audience was kind of basically smirking through the whole thing because they thought it was a joke. And Paul Buisac of ISIS fame. Paul is an interesting character if you've never met him. He was a circus ringmaster before he was an academic. So he does have a flair for the dramatic. So Crompton gives this thing, asks people if there are any questions. Nobody has any questions, so they don't know what to say. Buisac walks over, he has a little piece of lettuce, and he drops it on the podium and keeps going. That enraged John, and so he sat down and started on a treatise on why phytosemiotics was a legitimate discipline. Okay, because it irritated him that he and Buisac were friends. They were friends, but he just thought that was a nothing to do. Okay, the next two are actually kind of in connection with Merdine. I don't know if Merdine is still with us. Going back to the 1984 manifesto that John and Merdine and a number of people were working on, I came in. I was staying in a different place. I was staying at Massey, and they were staying at Margaret Addison, which was a dorm. And I walked in and said, "Hi, guys." And John looked at me and says, "We're hungry. Go get us some pizza." So all right. And he said, "Make it quick." So I go to the local pizzeria, and I figured it'd be faster to get pizza by the slice, because there are about 6 people. So I wait and wait and wait. It actually took longer to get the 6 slices, right? So I brought them in, and John said, "Well, it took you long enough." He said, "Well, I had to wait, to get the slices ready." He said, "Well, then why didn't you order a whole one?" And I said, "Well, because I thought this would be quicker." He says, "Now you know," right? So the wheelie dealy, that was a term that Merdine coined, right? So I give her full credit for that. John was always looking for an angle, and particularly in the 80s, he was always on the lookout to get to the forefront of the personal computer world. And as such, he became the sales distributor for a company called Atrix. Atrix was a personal computer with a screen. I don't know if you guys ever seen the Osborne computers. Their screen was about as big as a index card. Well, the Atrix had that kind of a screen, and it was the only computer, John said, that had a built-in printer. So you've got this computer, and it's portable, he said. You got a portable computer with a built-in printer. So you've got this screen, and then you got this dot matrix printer up here, right? And the whole thing is in a plywood case because it weighs 75 pounds. Okay, so this is John's portable computer. And so I asked Merdine about that. So what'd you think of that? She says, that's wheelie dealy for you, because he was always kind of wheeling and dealing. Those of you who knew him well know exactly what I'm talking about. The last one is one that's my particular favorite. At the time, I was living in Jasper, Indiana. I was teaching at St. Meinrad College, which was in St. Meinrad, Indiana, which is about 20 miles away. And Jasper, Indiana was this town just shy of 10,000 people and they were almost all German Catholics. And they've been German Catholics for generations. Okay. But anyway, because it was a good German Catholic town, they had a St. Vincent de Paul store. Okay. So I made it a habit of going in the St. Vincent de Paul store, just like sometimes I'll do with Goodwill. I don't know if anybody else does that, but I'll look in like Goodwill in these places amongst their books, because sometimes you can find real treasures. Most of the time you don't. But this time I found this real treasure. It was a book called Grammatica Speculativa of Thomas of Erfurt. So it was a translation of and for years, this Grammatica Speculativa was attributed to Duns Scotus. But just recently, at the publication of this book, it was credited to Thomas of Erfurt. So I thought, wow, this is a really cool book, right? And so John was coming to stay for, about 2 or 3 days. And he walked in and I said, hey, John, I got something cool to show you. And I showed him this book. And he looked at the book and he says, give it to me. I said, excuse me? He says, give me the book. You don't need that book. I need that book. You don't need that book. Give me the book. And he pestered me the entire weekend for me to give him the book. All right. He said, I don't know why you're keeping this book. You're not going to get as much use out of this book as I am. I deserve this book. You need to give me this book. Right. And so finally, I said, okay, John, you win. And I gave him the copy of Thomas of Erfurt. Right. So a couple of days later, I go back to the St. Vincent de Paul store. And I'm rummaging through the books. And lo and behold, I find a second copy of Grammatica Speculativa by Thomas of Erfurt. So, of course, I buy that, right? And I'm thinking, well, I was meant to give that to John. The reason I bring up these stories is just to indicate everybody who knows John has a similar list of stories. He was, in many ways, he was larger than life. He was very kind-hearted, very generous individual. He would do things for people without almost any thought about it. He was always very generous to me. One of the things is that he called me one time. This is the end of my discussion on this. He called me one time and he was very upset because he was going through the 4 Ages of Understanding and he had footnoted something I did, but he had forgotten to put it in the reference section, and he forgot to put my name in the index, and he was apologizing like crazy. I said, John, I'm happy to make a tiny little contribution to the whole thing. So those are the kind of lessons I learned from John Deely. Important lessons in philosophy, important lessons in semiotics, important lesson in life. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gary Shank, for this brilliant presentation on the works and life of John Deely. So I would like to invite now Dr. Marita Soto, but let me first introduce her. So Dr. Marita Soto holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. At the Argentinian National University of the Arts, she was Dean of the campus of the Transdepartmental Area of Arts Criticism. Under her administration, a bachelor's degree in arts curatorship and one in the art of writing were launched, along with the postgraduate specialization in the production of critical texts and media dissemination of the arts, and the master's degree in the history of modern and contemporary art, all of which designed from a well-defined semiotic perspective. She fostered the development of the UNA Institutional Archive and reinforced its publishing activities. She is professor and researcher at different Argentinian universities, where she has trained teachers, researchers, and younger semioticians. Soto has been in charge of specifically semiotic subjects such as semiotics of contemporary genres and semiotics of the arts. She is both a partner and director of Punctum, a studio specialized in research applied to the fields of consumption, aesthetics, and gender issues. In 2001 and 2002, she was the head of the Crisis Laboratory, where the research activities revolved around the problems of audience segmentation to observe new habits and mores in periods of crisis. Among her books, now I'll mention her books in Spanish: Telenovelas, El Volver de las Imágenes, which she wrote with Oscar Steinberg and Oscar Traversa. Another title, La Puesta en Cena de Todos los Días, and another one, Habitar and Narrar. All this bring together the results of her research. Soto was awarded the prize for the best paper presented at ESOMAR Conference São Paulo, which was published in Excellence International Research in 2003 with Fernando Moiger, George Carroll, and José Luis Petris. She was a member of the organizing committee of the 14th World Congress of Semiotics in Buenos Aires, and she has been trained and has worked together with Oscar Traversa, Oscar Steinberg, and Eliseo Veron. So it's a great honor to have you here, Dr. Marita Soto, and welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Before anything else, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in the seminar as a tribute to John Deely and to be able to comment on Professor Gary Shank's lecture. Certainly, the lecture is marked by the feeling of gratitude. It has diverse, multiple gratitudes in different dimensions. Thankfulness from Gary to John, from John to John, I'm referring to Poinsot, from John to Saint Thomas, from St. Thomas of Erfurt. Gratitude for ideas, concepts, theoretical positions. Gratitude also for the lessons for life. The first thing I want to emphasize is that I am convinced that gratitude is a virtuous path for the dissemination of knowledge, and it is also the guarantee of learning processes and the reassurance of good practices in research, whatever may be the field of research. In this sense, from the title of his lecture, Professor Gary Shank raises the issue of legacy, inheritance, transmission, dissemination from very different environments, as if he was designing a map of territory of legacies, from academic spheres to affective and profound ones, from institutional life through readings, concepts, methodologies, to private life. As Gary says, Deely, who taught me lessons simply about how he lived his life. It seems that in very transmission, these different spheres intertwine necessarily and fatally, not always well, not always successfully, but many times yes. When I listened to Dr. Shank, I thought about those teachers of others, my own teachers. And I always struck by the creative, provocative, and knowledge-promoting place of the great masters. The importance of legacy from the semiotics point of view is peak, and let us see crossing trajectories, paths, rows, and to put in theoretical terms of intertextualities of different types. Institutional, social logic in institutional instances, and individual instances, social, individual. When I say this, I remember the crossing between the ideas of Eliseo Verón and Luhmann, no? The two different plays of the production and reconnection. I would also like to emphasize the importance of research groups, no? Working together with colleagues as creative groups, or something like shared intelligence and shared understanding. In relation to the Gary's first question, the end dimensions of semiosis create this world full of meaning. The first question of Gary. In relation to the second question, I think because the questions that semiotics asks are for processes. In this way, it is possible to connect this first question and the goal of Gary's. Of the lessons learned from Deely on semiotics, I will briefly refer to triadic relation and the notion of relation. Gary says the dichotomies are actually truncated trichotomies. Trichotomies relations introduce temporal variations, ideological transformations, and the fallibility of the sign into the system itself. This functioning makes it possible to understand the process of signification. The notion of relation of signs is a key. It's an invisible, the relation between the thing and another thing. The second is the role of relation. According to Deely and of course Shank, if semiotics is a discipline that studies not what the sign is, but how the sign functions, then semiotics reveals what is the process of understanding of world. In this sense, semiotics serves to break fixed ways of understanding the world. It breaks commonplaces. It builds distances with things. It serves to understand the mediation of science, as Gary quoted, the age of relation instead of the age of science. Both the triadic relation and the role of relation and the definition of relation, both are projected in research processes. The first, by including connotation in the system, I take this notion from another important commentator of Peirce, Jean Fisset. The first reinstates transformation in the problem to be investigated. If research isolates a phenomenon of semiosis, it must know that it slows down the process of transformation. To recover it, it must combine different sample constructions. The fallibility of the sign implies not knowing that beforehand the endpoint. There is no possible teleology. The second, the role of relation, the notion of relation has decisive implication in research processes because it focuses attention on the limits of the phenomenon to be described and analyzed. What kind of relationship? Relationship between what? Between what thing and what another thing. For example, if our object is communication in an art museum and the type of institutional enunciation of this institution, its location in the city is not the same as communication in digital media or the institution's external and internal museography. The delimitation and therefore the type of relationship involved will depend on the questions of the researcher observer in the case semiotics. The position of the observer is implied in the definition of each relation. From the philosophical lesson, I also cut out the recovery of Peirce's open-ended thinking in Deely when he says, in 4H's, that postmodern period began with Charles Peirce and continuing to the present. Deely said, if the discovery of the science began as a matter of fact unconsciously with the discovery of nature, then the beginning of semiotics was first the beginning of philosophy, for only as philosophy are the foundations of semiotics possible, even if semiotic is what philosophy must eventually become. On the other hand, when it is also said that the boundaries are not fixed, it is also said that this thought is the basis of postmodern and transmodern thinking. What is connected in John Deely, what connected in Shank, what continues to intersect in the exchange. As many narratives says, destiny is the combination of the wrong or rare decisions one makes. The only problem is to accept them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marita Soto. Dr. Gary Shank, do you have any commentaries, response?
I that's that was an uh, extraordinary commentary, especially because I didn't give you a lot to work with, but you were able to bring in a really deep and rich understanding of relation and the role of relation. And I think one of the interesting things you said is when you quoted John saying that philosophy will eventually be semiotics. I think he always had that thought. I think he also had a kinship with Peirce because they were both very much dealing with logic. And I think as he got older, his writing became more clear because I think he was able to kind of build his own momentum of understanding. I used to tease him in the early days that his that I think I was talking about understanding semiotic. I said this book reads like it was translated from Latin, and he got a big laugh out of that. But he's very precise in his language, and as such, made it very uh, very profound. As long as you were able to kind of put it all together, but. Uh, so all I say is I agree with everything you said. I think it's a remarkable um, statement, and that's
Thank you.
all.
Thank you, Gary.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing it, and thank you, committee, for having us. I very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Gary Shank. It was a brilliant presentation. Also, Dr. Marita Soto, it was a brilliant commentary and discussion. So we'll close the broadcasting on YouTube now, but the floor is open to the audience present to ask questions or make other queries. Feel free.